And there was a lot of instability around that time. And I remember this sort of deep sense of being abandoned. If I was out on the parks with my mates trying to fit in, I'd be smoking weed on the park, I'd be drinking at like sort of 9, 10 years old. I wasn't in the military anymore, I'd be drinking to excess with my mates. Now I was adding cocaine into the mixer. I focus on helping others being more than sober so they can start building a life that they don't have to escape from. People don't know what life looks like in sobriety, going into this ocean of uncertainty. And tell me anybody that isn't afraid of that. Who am I going to be without alcohol? People that gravitate towards me are people that have shared similar parts of my story. A lot of people with underlying trauma, a lot of things that have happened in their life, which can be quite challenging for somebody. I'm like, oh shit. Term sobriety.
I think, as I say, sobriety for me has that connotation from society that, oh, I had a problem and I fixed that problem.
Alcohol is still the only drug that you have to justify not doing.
Oh, your parents don't drink, but because they don't drink, you're going to go left field and go absolutely wild.
I'm not sure if it was Gen X or Gen Z. Apparently, I think about 22% of them now are completely sober.
Welcome back to the Not Quite Pod. Today we've got Matt with us. Matt, do you just quickly want to introduce yourself and let everyone know a bit about yourself?
Hey everyone, so I'm Matt. I'm a sobriety and life coach, and I help grey area drinkers find clarity and fulfillment in their lives beyond alcohol so they can live with more peace and intention. And this work is so incredibly important to me through my own journey. I grew up around alcoholism. I grew up around a lot of trauma and emotional neglect, and inevitably I ended up taking that into my adult life, and alcohol became my coping mechanism for a lot of things. And when I finally got to the stage, there's a hell of a lot in between that, but when I finally got to the stage where I'd had enough of that, that's where everything started to change for me. Like, sobriety has been the single greatest thing that I've ever done in my life. And I'm so grateful to be here right now. It gave me the space to heal, to grow, to find out who I am, to choose who I am. And now I'm doing my best to help people do the same. And I don't just focus on being sober. I focus on helping others being more than sober so they can start building a life that they don't have to escape from.
What an introduction. I have to say that was quite impressive. And I'm really excited to get into this conversation because it's very much a topic that we've seen grow, particularly in recent years. And I've had a lot of conversations on the pod about it, how we best go about it, how we get rid of stigma. So let's start off with, tell us a bit about your journey, if you don't mind, so we can understand your context.
Okay, so I'll try and keep it as concise as possible, but like a lot of stories, Charlie, my story starts in childhood. My folks split up when I was 6 years old, and there was a lot of instability around that time. And I remember this sort of deep sense of being abandoned, this real sense of being abandoned. And we ended up moving around all the time. I think I'd been to 5 different schools in that time, and I was just this hurt little boy inside who was expressing that through anger. And because I was, sent to live with my mum, I was just playing up. I was out on the parks with my mates trying to fit in. I'd be smoking weed on the park. I'd be drinking at like sort of 9, 10 years old. And it got to the stage in my life where my mum's like, I can't deal with him. I don't mean that, I love my mum dearly, but so I got sent back to live with my dad, and for the right reasons, absolutely. But what happened is that when I started to grow up a little bit more, become a little bit more aware of what was going on in my life, it's like when I hit 18, it's like, great, I'm going to go drink and I'm going to do it to excess. And, I think it was fine for that sort of period in my life. Everyone's 18 to 21, we're loving life. You don't really realize what's going on. Yeah. But it wasn't until I got older, I joined the Air Force, and that drinking culture is absolutely wild there, which didn't help me at all. I loved it, don't get me wrong, but it didn't help me at all. But when things really started to change for me, when things started to get really, really bad, is I was in a long-term relationship. I'd moved out of the Air Force, I'd moved home, I was engaged to be married, and I broke it off. I broke off the wedding, and those deep senses of abandonment just came back to me. And I'm like, I can't do this. And so when I wasn't in the military anymore, I'd be drinking to excess with my mates. Now I was adding cocaine into the mixer and doing drink and drugs and just escaping my life. And it was just like, I got to this, sorry to try and cut this long story short here, but But inevitably, I ended up, we sold the house and I ended up taking a sabbatical from my work at the time for 3 months. And I went traveling into Central and South America. And the night that I got sober, I was in Colombia and I was drinking. I was on an all-night bender of drink and drugs. It was 11 o'clock the next morning. I hadn't been to bed. And I had this out of body experience. I remember being in the taxi back to the hotel and it's like the world had stopped around me. And it's like, I'm done. I just something came to me. I'm done. I can't run anymore. And that was it. And that was it. That was my moment. I booked a flight home. 3 weeks later, I'd quit my job. And the next 6 months, I was working wholly on me, my healing, all the shit that I'd been running away from, sharing a little bit about my story on social media. And it's led me into becoming a coach, which I'm so fucking grateful for. Truly am. And led me to where I am right now. So truly grateful for that.
What a journey. I mean,
Yeah.
I want to dive into it a bit more. So could you explain sort of what the beginning of that journey a bit more in terms of when you had that realization, and then what were the first sort of steps that you took to get sober and start that journey?
First steps, I think, is that I sort of come to the edge. I don't know how to explain this properly, but it's like I come to the edge of my skin. I couldn't live inside this like shell of the person that I wanted to be anymore. And that sort of first step was me, right, okay, I'm quitting my job. That wasn't serving the person that I wanted to be anymore. And it was like cutting off everything that no longer worked. And, so I've got a great track record of doing that. But this time it was about me. And it was about me taking this step and saying, right, okay, what's going on here? And I spent a lot of time, certainly that first 6 months of sobriety, a lot of journaling, a lot of soul searching and figuring out who I want to be and what I really want to do next.
One thing I always ask, like people that have struggled with addiction, is have you replaced, not in that way, but have you replaced the behaviors with anything? Because a lot of the time in that situation, you find people, well, they look for something else to replace it, a healthier alternative. Did you find anything like that during your journey?
I think so. I think I've done a lot of things, and how I see sobriety. Personally, I was talking about this very much about addiction. I personally saw myself as the grey area drinker, that person that wasn't quite an addict, but I knew that I wasn't just a normal drinker. But I would say I certainly changed addictions. I've always struggled with my weight, with my food, and I smashed it when I got sober. I started vaping, and I'm just like, oh God. And I think the big thing about that, Charlie, is that I gave myself a little bit of grace and say, you know what? I don't have to change everything overnight. And anybody that's listening to this right now as well, is that you don't have to change everything at once. I guess give yourself some grace is the point that I'm trying to make with that.
Because I think as well, when it comes to sobriety, I think everyone sees it as this, like, everyone goes cold turkey and it's like, boom, right, I'm sober now, I'm never touching it again. Was that your journey? Because I think as well, that's where you say people need to give people grace, of like, allow people to make mistakes. You're not going to nail it down first time. And also sobriety can look different for everyone.
Yeah, 100%. And you know what, Charlie, like, I remember when I got sober, I didn't say it was going to be forever. I said to myself, right, Matt, I'm going to go do 6 months. I'm going to go and work on me. I'm going to go get through this. And then I'll rehash this when I get to that 6 month mark. And something overwhelming, again, another overwhelming thing happened to me at that 6 month mark. And I know that I'm getting very, very deep about this again. But I always had this deep fear that I was going to turn into my alcoholic parent and repeat the same thing that happened to me. And I was terrified. It was a huge part of why I broke off the wedding. But inevitably, I'm like, I had that epiphany. It was like, well, if I don't drink, I can't do that. And ever since that, it was like this massive weight just came off my shoulders. Everything in my life just started like to breathe. And it's like, if I'm sober, I can't do that. And I haven't looked back since.
That's mad, because a lot of people say the same story of like, they go, I'll try it for 6 months, see what happens. And that will be that. And I say this as someone, I come from a family that drinking. So I was actually talking about this on a podcast the other day. Drinking is so much of an English culture. It's very much, and I come from very much that background. I've got part English, part Irish. Basic take the stereotype and smash them together. Yeah. That's basically what my family's like. And it's interesting that we're seeing now this shift towards being sober or steering away from it slightly. What have you seen from clients working with people as that shift starting to happen? How have you sort of guided them through it? Because I think there's so many more, particularly of my generation, that are exploring not drinking.
Yeah. I think one of the big things I see with a lot of people starting out on their sober journey is fear. A real fear about who am I going to be without alcohol? How am I going to deal with my emotions? How am I going to deal with the lack of confidence? How am I going to, who's the person I'm going to be when I'm not 10 pints deep and I'm the life and soul of the party? And I think the big thing about that, Charlie, is because people don't know what life looks like in sobriety. It's the unknown. And how I like to explain it is it's like going into this ocean of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And tell me anybody that isn't afraid of that. And my role as a coach is to try and bring certainty into that environment and to help them say, right, okay, what's this fear? What's holding you back? Because there's usually a belief behind that fear. And that's why it's so important to break down those limiting beliefs. So I think inevitably, once you can help people get through that fear, that's when you'll start to see the change.
Because one of my I think I've touched on it there, one of my big worries with when people go to sobriety is that whole thing of it's such a social thing that you then don't know what to do in that situation because everyone else is doing it. You're like, okay, what do I do now? And then there's the other movement of moving away from going to pubs and being in that situation. But then particularly as us in the UK being wet most of the time, finding those scenarios isn't the easiest. So how do you guide people through that in terms of, because I think the biggest fear is like, what do I do when my mates go, oh, let's meet up for a drink? And you want to be involved in that situation. So you might be on the beginning of a journey, struggling with being exposed to it and managing that. How did you manage that? And also, how do you advise clients on it?
I think personally, there's going to have to be this level of you know that it's going to be uncomfortable. You know that it's going to be this massive change, but inevitably it doesn't mean that you've got to come and shut yourself off in your room and not see the world. I think something that's really important is that, this is why I focus so much on becoming more than sober. It's because alcohol fills those voids in our life. And it's like, what do I do when I haven't got that? And what I believe is that when we take alcohol away, we've got to start bringing life back in. And maybe I go to a little bit of the extreme. Okay, what can we do? What hobbies can we do? Can we go and learn a language? Can we go and actually speak to our friends and say, listen, how do you fancy about going and getting a coffee today? How do you feel about going out for dinner or going to the cinema and doing something that doesn't have to involve alcohol? Yeah. But I know firsthand as well, because all my mates, I surrounded myself with mates who would just go out and drink and do all that sort of stuff. And it's like, oh shit, what do I do now? Yeah. So inevitably, I think the most important thing is that we have to accept that there is going to be some level of uncomfortability, but we have to learn to stretch our boundaries to go and try something new.
What did you start that with? Like, what did you turn to sort of do something different? What was your turning point?
I think I was really quite lucky, actually. I'm a keen cricketer. Obviously, I couldn't play a lot whilst I was in the Air Force, but now that I live back at home, when I got sober, sort of came into that line of, all right, January nets is starting. So I spent a lot of my time, I spent a lot of money getting coaching X, Y, and Z. And I think that was almost like my change in addiction. But I'd go out and do it with a friend and friends, and I'd be playing cricket 3 or 4 times a week. And then when I wasn't doing that, I lived very, very close to my dad. I'd be going seeing him and building that relationship back up with him again. And like I said, I spent a lot of time on building my business. That was me stretching my boundaries, becoming something new. So I know that that's not going to be the same for everybody, but we have to find something to fill that time. Otherwise, you're very likely going to go insane. Really, really challenging. So.
What about the move? Obviously, you briefly mentioned it there, the move on to social media and sharing your story. And obviously now that's a massive business for you. What was the thought process behind that in terms of a lot of people are quite anxious when sharing a story that's so personal to them? What was the thought process like for you?
I think initially it was very, very challenging. And don't get me wrong, I didn't come out straight away and say that this is my life and I'm going to throw it all down the line here. I didn't. I think it was just sharing some things that I'd learned about life. And then when you start building a little bit more confident, you start getting a little bit more personal. And it's like, people are actually recognizing this in themselves. Yeah. People are relating to my story and understanding it, because I felt like the only person on earth. I felt like the only person on earth had been through the things that I'd been through. And now that I realize, oh shit, I'm not alone in this. I can share a little bit more and I can help. Like, this is what I've done. And I think it just naturally led to me, right, okay, now how can I help other people that have been through this situation? And that's just what it's naturally led to.
And then led you to coaching as well. And what was that like in terms of in how do you now guide people through it? Like, if I was coming to you and said, right, Matt, I need coaching, where do you start with that? What sort of questions do you ask in the beginning? Can you walk us through sort of what the process might look like?
I think with me, if somebody's reaching out to me on social media, my initial is to get them on a phone call with me. Let's just discuss and let's have this real honest conversation, because I think it's terrifying for somebody to reach out and get help. It can be for a lot of people. I remember
Yeah.
I've been in therapy and I've done that, and it's like, oh shit, I've got to admit that I've got a problem. So I think the first initial step is to understand what's really going on for them. To understand, right, okay, I understand that about you. And the step of, right, okay, is this holding you back in your life right now? This fear, this limiting belief, what's your relationship like with alcohol? And inevitably what you want for the rest of your life. What does more than sober look like for you? And my real goal as a coach is, okay, your A here is that, okay, I'm starting it here. I've maybe got a little bit of trauma. My relationship with alcohol isn't great, similar to mine. How are we going to get you to 90 days sober and start feeling more promising about that area of your life? And I'll go through that in very specific terms. I'll probably have you here all day if I go into great detail about it, Charlie. So
That's all right. I mean, in terms of like, so is that how you sort of start off in terms of, right, let's just why don't we set this as a target? Okay, let's get to a week, then we get to a month. And is that how the process sort of starts if someone's looking to get sober?
So it will naturally depend on the person that I come into, but because I'm not working with, people who are struggling with alcoholics, that there's not as much risk involved about people relapsing or the struggles with withdrawal symptoms. So the usually thing that I really find is, okay, right, okay, my goal here is let's get you 90 days sober. If there's any stumbling blocks on that journey, let's just discuss it. Let's just unpick that. And I'm not going to judge you for doing that, because sobriety isn't linear. And the big thing that we must learn on that journey is, okay, this is what happened, and this is how I'm going to learn from it, and this is how I'm going to grow. So I think a lot of people are very, very different depending on their life circumstances, but I've not had many people. I think I've had one person have a quick relapse on my program, and then we just unpicked it, and then we went back there, and I've never had anybody sort of fall off. Fingers crossed yet. So that's.
I'll ask you a really personal question. You don't have to answer it, but I'm just curious. Did you ever relapse or fall off in terms of your sobriety journey? Was there any points where it didn't quite go to plan?
Well, my journey to sobriety started way longer before I got sober. Mm-hmm. My journey to sobriety started 10 years ago. I always knew that I wanted to get sober. I had this belief that I wanted to do a year. And it took me to get to that stage in my life where I'm like, I can't do this anymore. That I got there. And thankfully, I've not fallen off in that time of me being sober. I had a very, very, I don't say a minor slip up, but I had some serious doubts at my 6-month mark. Real serious doubts. And I'm really, really thankful to have somebody in my corner that's been sober for nearly 30 years and say, listen, Matt, what's the right next thing? So me personally, I haven't fallen off the wagon, if that's how you want to call it. Yeah. But one big thing that I always think about myself is that don't ever get naive in your sobriety. Life will throw you things that we can't always know how to deal with in the right way. So thankfully, I've not had any hiccups. But when I do, I've surrounded myself with community, the learnings that I do, and having the people that can pick me up if I need it in my sobriety.
I suppose as well, as a fellow sports person, you kind of lean on sports as that like release if you're having a stressful day, and it's about that like replacing those behaviors like you did with cricket of what's another thing that can give me that release, but that isn't alcohol. And you could argue as well from a sport perspective, it's going to have much more benefit than drinking alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things I've learned, I think the most important thing that I've learned about my sobriety, and certainly, what I try to teach and teach other people, is about building that emotional resilience. Because it's not about just coping with something and going and avoiding those emotions and feelings with something else through sport or whatever. One of the biggest lessons that I had to learn is actually start recognizing my emotions, putting names to them. There's this wonderful technique by Tara Brach who says, recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. Yeah.
Yeah.
if you've heard of it. And it's this wonderful, wonderful thing. And I'm like, I'm not here trying to take credit for that. That works, and it worked for me, and I try my best to help others do it. But we have to learn that we don't have to run away from our emotions, that the best thing that we can do is start accepting them, but we need to be building our life that allows us to have more joy and fulfillment. So I guess we reduce the frequency of having those moments that we all have.
Do you like? Is there a certain? Do you see a client struggling with a similar issue? I know, obviously, particularly in your work, being less in more sort of the I don't know another way to say it, pre-addiction phase of like, there's something not quite right, but you're not full blown just yet. Yeah. Have you seen any trends that sort of you're seeing with clients in terms of what they come to you with? Because I think what's going to be nice if you can highlight is that whole thing of there's a lot of people out there that don't think that they're on that path, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people that gravitate towards me are people that have shared similar parts of my story. A lot of people with underlying trauma, a lot of things that have happened in their life, which can be quite challenging for somebody. I'm like, oh shit, am I qualified to do this, X, Y, and Z? But the big thing that I find about this is that a lot of people just need space. To be held for them in that time. And I'm always, and I don't know if you can tell this about me, but I like to think I'm this very, very empathetic person. And inevitably, it's okay to go into some aspects of of their lives with me as a coach, but obviously I can't go into great detail because I'm not a doctor, I'm not a therapist. So the big thing about that is whatever therapies that they're going through, their traumas that they're going through, they're usually linked to emotions. So inevitably, this happened and it makes me feel this way, which makes me want to drink. So inevitably, if we can work on that emotion and your reaction to it, maybe that's going to help with that right now. And that's been a massive help for those people. So the people that are coming to me with little bits of trauma, it's usually just about building emotional resilience. And that goes into the emotional mastery part of my program.
Would you like to see the world eventually become less reliant on alcohol, or would you like to actually, let's go one step further, would you like to see a completely sober society?
Oh, that's a great question. Do you know what would I love that? I'm not sure, but the only reason why I'm saying that, Charlie, is because I don't think it ever would. But I guess the big thing that I'm seeing right now is how much society has changed towards alcohol. The society is changing towards the term sobriety. I think if you had this conversation 10 years ago, if somebody said to you that I'm sober, everyone's thinking, well, you're an alcoholic and you've got a problem. But now it's just this case of like, people are starting to wake up to the downfalls of alcohol, that inevitably it's the most harmful drug in the world and it's poisonous to humans. And I know that's very, very controversial. Please don't bite me off. But no, it's very, very controversial, but it's the truth. But ever since like what's happened with, the influx of social media creators, online coaches, and people actually sharing their journey about the truth of alcohol and what's gone on for them, I think it's starting to give people the permission to say that I can choose to go sober without people looking at it that way. So going back to your point is that I don't think that we'll ever be fully sober, but I think we're going to see this continually spike over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
I think so too. And I think as well, it's that whole thing of, like you said, it's reframing sobriety in terms of, I don't think sobriety is the right word. I think it almost, you just go, I don't drink. Like it's just, because I think, as I say, sobriety for me has that connotation from society that, I had a problem and I fixed that problem, rather than I just made a choice. It's like I always put it down to when people go, oh, why don't you drink? I'm like, it's essentially the same thing as going, you don't like mushrooms, I don't. You like mushrooms, I don't like mushrooms. That's why. That's the crux of this conversation. But it's just because it's so ingrained in us that, when we go out and when we socialize, we have to drink. And I think it's so strange that we're not. That's still part of the conversation. Why has it got to be a big deal? I mean, it's interesting as well because the shift's happening a lot more with my generation of not having that sort of connotation to it. Whereas when you have that conversation, like say, come from an English and Irish background, if my family catch me with a 0 beer in my hand, they're like, what are you doing? And they're like, I don't want to drink today. And like, there's nothing wrong with that. But on that note, what do you think of the spike we've seen in zero alcohol drinks becoming available, like
Mhm.
zero beers, zero wines, and zero spirits?
Mhm. I'm just going to go back to that quickly to that point that you just made,
Yeah.
Charlie. And I think Chris Williamson said this about alcohol is still the only drug that you have to justify not doing. And it's a wild, wild thing. It's
Yeah.
a really, really crazy thing. And it is. And
Yeah.
I know that society is changing overall to it, but there's still a lot of people that are very, very protective over their alcohol use. And I get it. I was it for a long time. I get it. But I think around alcohol free drinks, I think they're a wonderful tool, but they come with risks as well. And I think that we need to be very, very careful about how we utilize them. For me, they were a massive help in my early sobriety. Now I don't drink them so much. But I think the most important thing that we have to understand about alcohol-free drinks is what's the intention behind drinking it? Is it you going back and repeating the same cycles that you were doing? Are you sat on the couch? Are you feeling lonely? Are you bored? So I'm going to go and have a full bottle of alcohol-free wine, because inevitably it's like repeating that cycle that you've tried so hard to work from. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
interesting because I have a slightly, which you might unpick. I have a slightly different perspective. So mine is one in the context of like, if you're in a bar, it then gives you like the psychological thing of like, I'm included in this scenario. Whereas if you're sitting there with your water, your Diet Coke or whatever, it's a very much psychologically, it's like, I know I'm not, I'm not, I'm not part of that right now. But then also on the flip side, I think it's interesting because you say about replacing that behavior, but then I have a different perspective of, I view it as like, say your behavior is, oh, on a Friday after work, I have a beer. And that's kind of like my time to sit and decompress. That to me, if you do that with a zero beer, is quite a healthy behavior because you're just basically doing the same process, but you're removing the negative side of it. But I'd be interested to see what your perspective is on it.
No, Charlie, and listen, mate. What I was going to come on to with that as well is I know I'm a coach and I can say all this and I've got my opinion, but inevitably listen to what's right for you.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing with this, because yes, alcohol-free drinks can be a trigger. Yes, they can be a wonderful thing that's going to help you stay social and whatever. And people might say, "Why are you drinking that?" You know, I'm just like, listen, do what's right for you and what feels safe. And if you really like having that alcohol-free beer and it's part of your routine and it feels healthy and safe for you, who am I to tell you any different? So that's the real thing. Listen to what feels right for you.
So do you now not use any of the, well, very rarely use any of the alcohol-free products?
You know what? This is going to sound really, really strange. I like an alcohol-free Guinness.
Yeah.
And I had some left in my fridge since before Christmas, and unbeknowingly, I've still had them in there since. So I've done like my first alcohol-free dry January. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, the old version of me would absolutely kill myself for that. But now I'm just like, they were great at the early part of my sobriety.
Yeah.
Now it's just, okay, I'm going to have one when I feel like it, because it's not an issue for me. And that's me listening to myself.
I think it's interesting because I, as someone that still drinks, but obviously is trying to be more mindful of it, I still enjoy that. Like, I don't know. It's just it's for me, it's very much the physical behavior. I don't know what it is. I just, that's what it is for me. Cause I think that's what I've enjoyed with seeing more and more come onto the market, because it's giving you more options. Cause the amount of times you wouldn't want to drink, but the default position was, oh, if you're not drinking, your options are extremely limited. Whereas if you are drinking, you've got all this choice. So it's really, for me, it's quite nice to see that transition happening.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's incredible how much effort people are putting into this, because it shows the mass amount of demand. And I remember I was like going into the beer shop when, you know, I used to like all the IPAs and all that sort of stuff. I was like a kid in a sweet shop. And now it's like the alcohol-free drinks are coming out. I'm like, oh, great, I get to go and try something else for the first time now. But I just do it in a little bit more moderation. But I guess the real key point that I keep coming back to is, firstly, listen to what's right for you. Okay. And sort of understand the reasons why we're going to that. Do you know what I mean?
I think the interesting thing is, you mentioned earlier, like, that we're slowly moving towards a more sober society. And I think that also they say it comes from, one, we're better educated now. But I love playing this little trick, because one of my friends said to me once, could you imagine someone goes into the Dragon's Den one day, and for the American listeners, that's Shark Tank, and goes, I've got this chemical that if we drink it or consume it,
Yeah.
it's going to give you a really bad headache. It's probably going to make you feel terrible. You're probably going to do something stupid. What do you guys think? Does anyone want to invest?
Yeah, I know.
It's so strange. And then, funny enough, I was having a conversation this week with another guest on the pod about the harm scale.
Yeah.
And we were having the conversations about mushrooms and psychedelics. And it was that interesting thing of mushrooms are so much lower on the harm scale in comparison to alcohol. But alcohol is readily available. And it's so strange how it's just ingrained in our society.
It's wild, isn't it? Like it's become this so socially acceptable thing, and I'm certainly not going to preach. It's not who I am, but I think, and something that might even be controversial now, is that imagine if alcohol was brought out today, would it be legal? That's the real question, and maybe even something a little bit more controversial is all those people that were speaking about putting COVID vaccines into your body, but still willingly going. But anyway, without having pitchforks at the door, do you know what I mean? Get him out of here! But it's a wild thing how incredibly just normal it is. But I think as society, as a world, we are starting to wake up a little bit to the real negative effects of what alcohol is having in our life.
I think the biggest realization for me was the impact on sleep. Because I remember, as I still drink now, but I remember just before my sister's wedding, I did 6 weeks no drinking. And I've never slept that well since. And it's just, it's a great thing because I know the science behind it. I know why it happens because you don't actually sleep properly after alcohol. But I think that was the biggest difference. And then also the cognitive difference as well was massive.
Yeah, that's all to do with like the REM sleep cycle, isn't it? Because they say that, of course, alcohol is this sedative and it will help you get to sleep. That's why we've all come in battered and we're just out like a light. You go and have your 10, 11 hours sleep, but then you still feel like you're absolutely knackered, don't you? Because the REM sleep cycle, rapid eye movement phase of our sleep, is just absolutely ruined. And that's why you feel so just lethargic all the time, don't you? So maybe people don't see that enough, but it's a wild thing.
I think it's also that whole thing of a lot of the time, like, obviously people do dry January, but then I found as well, the longer I got into it, the bigger the difference was. So then dry January, you almost start seeing the good stuff, but don't get all the way through.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm saying this only doing a couple of weeks. You're on years. So I'm not one to comment really.
No. And I think dry January is a wonderful thing. And believe me, Charlie, I've been in that position where I've done every dry January, I've done every dry July, sober October, because for me, that was me trying to prove that I didn't have a problem. That was part of it. And of course, I wanted to take a break. I'd been on Christmas and done absolute wild stuff. But personally, taking any break from alcohol is a great thing for you. It really, really is. But I guess the real question is what happens when February comes? Yeah. Are you going to go back to the version of yourself that you still were? Or are you going to change it? Is it a stepping stone for what you want for the future? So I guess anybody right now that's going through dry Jan, what I would say to you is that the most important aspect of this is taking some time to reflect on your journey, what you've learned about yourself. Okay. Have I grit my teeth and bared through this, or is there something here that I need to address? Me personally, I would love to see dry January change into the dry quarter of the year, because I really think that sort of 90-day period is such a wonderful chance to really experience and get the majority of the benefits that sobriety brings you.
What about, like, do you think that we'll see a change of parenting as well? Because I'm curious about this one, because I had a very interesting conversation with my parents a few years ago about them introducing me, my cousins and my sister to alcohol slightly earlier than what people would anticipate. And the rationale behind it was actually really interesting, because they basically said that what they were seeing was if you held it away from a young person, then when they did get access to it, they'd go absolutely nuts. Whereas their perspective was that if we introduce you to it, we can control that environment for you. And then also you don't have this like, I really want it because I can't get hold of it. It was a very different, obviously that was that was, it's again, that's just how I was brought up. But then I'm finding it interesting now as we go more into a sober society, whether those conversations are going to change when it comes to parenting.
That's a great question, that Charlie. And I've seen both ends of the spectrum on this. You know, certainly from my own childhood, I saw that alcohol was used as this tool, and it was used to excess. It was there to cope with things. That's what I learned about it. But when I was in my one of my long term relationship, I saw the people that they were allowing their kids to drink at around about 14, 15, but drink responsibly. You can have that glass of wine at dinner, and we're going to act responsibly as well. So although I don't really know the science behind that, I think it's how you're taught about alcohol, what you learn about that situation. I think that parenting has such a huge impact on people's relationship with alcohol.
I think it's interesting because I'm going to be intrigued to see if less people, because the interesting thing is, will society, will there still be this want from the next generation to drink? So in terms of fueling that, like, oh, your parents don't drink, but because they don't drink, you're going to go left field and go absolutely wild? Or are they going to go down the route of mum and dad don't drink, never really drunk, so it doesn't really bother me?
Yeah. I think I was reading something a couple of months back. I'm not sure if it was Gen X or Gen Z, but apparently I think about 22% of them now are completely sober. Completely sober. So inevitably, yes, there will be a cannonball effect where they don't drink, so their children won't drink. But there will always be discrepancies amongst that. But I think as long as we're starting to build this environment, with Gen Z coming through, with the sober curious movement coming through, the more influence around sobriety and making it socially acceptable, I think that is going to have a massive cannonball effect. And I think by hopefully by the end of my life, that we're going to see a complete change of complete perspective shift on sobriety. But time will tell. There'll always be people.
Yeah, I say I'm just intrigued by this theory that, like, because I know from watching Friends and watching, I love people watching, and I know from the behaviors, I know that we have this thing of like, oh, we've got rid of this thing, what can we replace it with? And I'm just intrigued to see what that leads us to, especially because obviously there's the conversation just being had around different drugs. Are they going to then go, oh, we've stopped drinking, but we've all started doing this? Yeah. Is that going to be the dynamic? It's going to be really interesting to see. I don't know. I honestly don't know where we're going to end up. Mm-hmm. And I don't know as well, because there is the argument of the government push it quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And the whole argument of, oh, it's because you can tax alcohol and that's why it's pushed so much. And that's very, like, I'm saying that as just a general point. It's not something I have any deep feelings about. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where we go. But what do you think?
I think that's a really thought-provoking question. Because I hear about this all the time. I hear about, well, the kids they're not drinking, but they're doing drugs instead. And I'm just like, I'm only seeing this from my perspective. I never did drugs without alcohol. It was like, that was but this is my own personal journey, and I'm seeing sobriety through my eyes. Mm. So inevitably, do I know if they're replacing it? Do I think that they will replace it? I think there's a high likelihood. But whether or not are people going just directly to edibles, which has become massive in the US right now? Are people doing that, or are we going to start a complete different addiction that we don't even know anything about right now? But inevitably,
it's just that craving decompression, because I think the other thing we often have when we bring up the conversations of alcohol is the pressures of life. And like, you can say until you're blue in the face that, oh, if you manage your diary and you manage, like, what you're willing to take on, that's fine. But what we really need to fix is the work environment, because that's one of the big ones. The work environment and the children and having kids environment, because I still can't wrap my head around why the school day finishes at 3, but the majority of people that work the 9 to 5 traditional role finish at 5. How did we end up there? And then obviously I know there's the argument of shift workers, but that's, as a generalization, those two scenarios don't work, because you've got parents are stressed out their nut because they've got their little ones to worry about. Then there's the whole trying to build your career and you're growing through that scenario, but then the work situation doesn't allow for it. I think that's my biggest worry is they sit there going, the main reason people turn to alcohol is because they want that escape and they want that decompression. Or to be fair, that they want. I think the big thing is that decompression of like they've been. The way I describe it is like they've been in gear 6 for like the whole day, and they just want something to allow them to shift down. And I think that's my biggest concern.
And it is, and it's an absolutely true concern. I've done it a lot. I'm sure you've done it. We've all had shit days where we come back and fuck, I want to drink. I want to do that, and I get it. But inevitably, we have to understand what is right or wrong for us. Are we continually going for that alcohol to soothe something in us? Are we continually seeking that dopamine hit to get rid of the monotony of our lives, the things that we don't like about ourselves? I know this might be a really, really deep question, but what we need to start looking at is what's the problem here? What do we really need to address? Is it this massive stress? And I'm not trying to say be really, really arrogant with this statement, because I know that people live extremely busy lives. Okay. But then maybe we need to start shifting priorities. Okay. My job isn't serving me right now. So how am I going to work on that? Yes, it's going to be uncomfortable for a year, for 2 to change my career, X, Y, and Z. But inevitably we've got to stop seeking that short-term gratification that alcohol brings us and start thinking about the long-term happiness of us, of ourselves. But I know that's easier said than done, and we're hardwired for quick reward, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that is the biggest problem. Is like I understand the rationale behind like, oh, check, like if something's not right, you've got to change it, and I completely agree to that. But then I know that society, we're not there yet. We're very much like, no, but I want it now. If you say to someone, it's that whole argument of doing the debate of it. I give you £1 million now, or I teach you to make £1 million. Yeah. Logical person would go, teach me, because then I can do it again. Yeah. But then the quick winner will go, no, I'll just take the money and run. And it's so hard. And I think that alcohol is such a weird thing when we talk about that, because it is that instant, this will instantly soothe. Whereas actually what's unpacking the problem. It's interesting because one other thing that I've said before, which I've actually opened up about in therapy sessions, is for me, weirdly, like, so I have a very chaotic brain, as you can probably tell. Run a podcast, run about 5-6 different projects, chaotic. But the weirdest thing is my partner always says to me, why is it that after like 1 or 2 beers, it's like your brain can pick out the right idea. It's like you just turn into this whole, and it's really weird because it's something that's worried me, because I've been like, why does my brain do that? So why is it that I get to that point and suddenly it's like clarity appears, when that from the science side of things doesn't make sense? And it's a really weird thing. Have you had that conversation with any clients? I'm just intrigued because I'm sitting there, am I a complete outlier? And this is just a weird thing that my brain does. And I know it's not healthy either. And it's like, weird. It's proper weird.
Listen, I think this is don't be overly concerned about that. It's not, I would say it's not the end of the world unless you're doing this every day and it's like, oh great, I've got to go and have 5-6 beers to go and have that. Yeah. And inevitably, if you've got a lot of things going on in your head, do I think that alcohol is the absolute answer to that? No. Of course I don't. Yeah. What can we do first? That's the biggest thing that we can do. But inevitably, I hope I'm not coming across as this person that thinks that absolutely all alcohol is bad and this, that, and the other. Inevitably, but to be really honest here, if you haven't got a problem, I don't give a shit. I don't. What really bothers me, yeah, it is. I don't. I'm not this like, stop drinking now. If you've got a problem, that's where I really, really care about. But for you, Charlie, is that if you're finding that sort of clarity and it's allowing you to relax and de-stress from that part of your life, that's okay, right? Yeah. Unless you're like, well, this is a fucking problem. There's nothing wrong with you. We're all human beings and we've all got our uniqueness. And if that's yours, my man, embrace it.
I mean, I just love asking that question. I brought it up to a couple of people because I just find it so strange, and like it's weird. I mean, even my friends are like, it's so strange because I'll come up to them like, I've got the solve. I know what it is. Yeah. And they're like, what? Reached out for a beer. What?
Well, that sounds like it's the miracle juice for you, man. Do you know what I mean? And if that works and you know that about yourself, I'm not going to say, well, I encourage you to do it all the time, because obviously can't really do that. But Whatever works for you. And I wish I had the answers for you, Charlie, but I really don't.
It's really weird. No one's been able to answer it, so it's clearly just the Charlie special. But what about people on their journey if they want to start looking into sobriety, but they're not quite at the point of coming to see you and wanting what sort of some starting point so you can give people?
Yeah. I think what we're talking about here is a lot of people out there who are sober curious. I think they're starting to think about, am I really sure about what alcohol is doing in my life right now? So I guess the question that I want to ask yourself is alcohol serving the person that you want to be? Are there some changes that you would like to see changed that alcohol doesn't help you with anymore? And what I'll say to you is that if you're sober curious, no, it doesn't mean that you have to go into full blown sobriety. If you feel like moderation is a possibility for you, consider that. Okay. Yeah. But one thing that I will say to you is surround yourself in an environment that encourages it and supports it. Come and follow people like me, other sobriety coaches, other content creators, listen to sobriety podcasts and say, you know what? I think I quite like that. And you don't have to, if not everybody has to come and see people like me. They don't. But inevitably, I think the most important thing is that point that I made at the start is if you think that you're becoming out of balance with alcohol, it just take a little bit of time to reflect on that and surround yourself with things that serve the person that you want to be.
Is there any, books or anything, or like a podcast that you'd recommend for people to listen to if they're sober curious and they want to start getting involved in that space and just learning more about it? Is there any recommendations that you have?
Yes. What have we got here? There's this book that I read right at the start. Oh God. And it was wonderful. I can't think of it. God, what is it? Oh, Jesus, mate. Oh God, I can't think of it, but it was this wonderful, wonderful book, and it's about, by Sean Alexander. Don't even think of it. Sorry, mate, it's completely lost me. But when I first got sober, it's completely lost me. But when I first got sober, this book was wonderful. It starts to tell you about how society sees alcohol, how it changes us as individuals, and the things that it helps us with. And I think that anybody sober curious should read this book, which I'm going to give you as soon as I think about it. But for me, what else have I got? The only sort of other one that I read personally, like book wise, was obviously due to my work around inner child and things like this, was How to Heal Your Inner Child by Simon Chappell. So I know it might not be completely about sobriety, but Simon Chappell is a sobriety coach. His story is very much sort of aligned with mine and some of the things, and he's this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful coach. And that's a great book. I'm really sorry that book has really, really stumped me.
That's all right. Message us after. We'll link it below.
Yeah, so I will do, mate.
If anyone wants to check it out. But it's an interesting one. That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. It's interesting though, because I think there's so much of wanting to do that research before you dive into something. So I think it's always nice to get someone to go, what did you use? Because I think as well, with sobriety, it's such a personal journey, and some people can be quite ashamed is probably the wrong word, but quite wary of it. So then to give them those tools. What about in terms of, is there any like groups that you can look at?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I run my own Facebook group called the Sober Outpost. You can come and find that on Facebook groups. You can join that. I've got some wonderful friends who do, what's it called? The Freedom from Alcohol group. And there's this wonderful one as well, a really great friend of mine is called the Afters group, by Steph. I'm not sure if anybody's seen that, but it's really, I think, I'm not trying to disgruntle away from my own group, but if you're just sober curious and you want to just think about whatever's happening outside of the world, I think Steph has got that absolutely nailed down. She really, really has. And I think she's got about 600 or 700 people in there. They're doing events all the time. And I think if anybody's just curious, of course you can come and join my group, but Steph is just absolutely just killing it right now. So Steph at the Afters is my absolute 1,000,000% recommendation for that.
And we'll also try and link everyone below as well. So if you do want to check them out as well, we'll link them below. But then lastly, I'm going to ask you the question that I ask every guest, which is what's one piece of politically correctness that you really strongly agree with or disagree with?
I really struggle with this, Charlie. Political correctness. Do you know what? The only thing This is, I don't even know if this is politically correct, but as I'm a Yorkshireman, it's the only thing that is coming to my mind right now.
Yep.
And it's this old statement that my dad used to say: if it's not Yorkshire, it's shite. So
I'm guessing that's now the root of tea.
Yeah. If it's not Yorkshire, it's shite. I'm really sorry. I'm not hugely political, so I don't have this massively unpolitical statement.
So if it's not Yorkshire, it's shite.
If it's not Yorkshire, it's shite. Unless it's Leeds, people will get that. That's my controversial, but yeah, unless it's Leeds, it is shite. I'm a Huddersfield fan, they'll get it.
Thank you so much for coming on, Matt. It's been a great conversation, and I think a lot of people are going to learn a lot from it, and even just to start these conversations of sobriety. So thank you so much for coming on. Obviously, we'll link all of Matt's details below as well. So if you do want to check him out, I'm sure we will answer any questions you have. As always, guys, I'm happy to answer any questions as best I can. But the guest is always right, is the way I look at it. But thank you so much for coming on. And thank you.
Thanks, Mary. I appreciate you holding space for me. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Not Quite Podcast. Please make sure you follow us on TikTok and Instagram to get regular updates about the podcast. These my doubts make it hurt.